It's that time of the year again where I make a video about something spooky scary. And what could possibly be scarier than the threat of imminent nuclear annihilation? I'm going to start off with some ancient history. The first Russian state was the Kievan Rus, founded by a dynasty of Vikings, the Rurikids, that sailed up and down the rivers of Eastern Europe conquering Slavic tribes. They were named for their capital of Kiev, the present capital of Ukraine. The Rus would convert to Orthodox Christianity and rule the lands that would become Belarus, Ukraine, and the Russian heartland for centuries, up until the Mongol invasion. The Mongols established several small Slavic vassals under their rule, and later the rule of their western successor state, the Golden Horde. The Rurikids were placed in charge of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, commonly called Muscovy. While a vassal of the Golden Horde, they would conquer and absorb other Slavic vassals, growing more powerful until they could overthrow the Horde and gain independence. The Horde would collapse shortly thereafter, leaving behind its own successors, the most important of which will be the Crimean Khanate, ruled by the Crimean Tatars, and centered in and around the Crimean Peninsula. They'll be important later. Muscovy sought to reunite the former lands their dynasty once ruled and established a new Russian empire. But the problem was that in the intervening time period, the westernmost parts, Ukraine and Belarus, had been absorbed into Poland, including the historic capital of Kiev. A series of wars between Russia and Poland would ensue, and Poland would win all of the early ones, even annexing some territory from Russia, namely the city of Smolensk. This tide of Russian losses to Poland would turn when Russia finds a particularly opportune time to strike. That moment would come when Poland gets invaded by Sweden at around the same time as a group of Ukrainian Cossacks called the Zaporizhian Hetmanate rises up in rebellion over mistreatment by Polish magnates. Russia, seeing an opportunity to regain Smolensk and some older territory of the Rus, intervenes on behalf of the Cossacks, promising them freedom if they fight for Russia. The resulting war would be known in Poland as the Deluge, as it was like a flood of invaders. Most of Poland's eastern territories, namely in Ukraine and Belarus, were thus occupied. A third of Poland's population was killed. In the end, Russia retook Smolensk, annexed the left bank of the Dnipro River, which is a vast swath in the northeast of Ukraine, and take their historic city of Kiev. The Cossack Hetmanate would not find freedom in Russia. Their territories were divided between Russia and Poland. Treaties guaranteeing their autonomy were broken before the war had even ended, and eventually Russia would abolish the Cossacks' hetman altogether, ruling the territory of the former Zaporizhian Hetmanate directly. This would initiate the Russification of Ukraine. This process would greatly take off under the rulership of Catherine the Great, in large part due to her partitioning Poland. After the deluge, Polish power was broken, and in a series of war, Russia, Prussia, and Austria would divide the territory of Poland up amongst themselves, war after war, until there was no Poland left to partition. Russia got the lion's share of it, gaining all of Belarus and the Baltic states, the heart of Poland including Warsaw, and most of Ukraine. Catherine would also conquer the Crimean Khanate in a separate war. Again, it will be relevant later. As more and more of Ukraine was owned by Russia, Russia sought to make it more Russian. Local government and laws were abolished, institutions that promoted local languages or cultures over that of Russian were disbanded, the Ruthenian Uniate Church, which had come to be the main religious body to which Ukrainians and Belarusians belonged, was persecuted and eventually abolished, as the Russians believed everyone should be part of the Russian Orthodox Church. As concepts like national identity grew in popularity across Europe, a crackdown on Ukrainophiles would also kick into gear in Ukraine, with academics and artists across Ukraine who promoted the idea of a unique Ukrainian culture or nation were arrested. In essence, as the Russians saw it, Ukraine was always an important part of Russia. Ukrainians were always Russians, and they needed to start acting like it. These trends would continue, Tsar after Tsar, until the last Tsar, Nicholas II. There's a lot to say about Nicholas II and how horrifyingly unfit to rule Russia he was. Seriously, the original version of the script had like 2 pages dedicated to him. But nothing expresses this fact greater than his performance in World War I. In essence, he ran Russia into the ground so badly he was overthrown mid-war. What would ensue was a chaotic period of civil war in which communists, liberals, and separatists vied for power over who would rule the new Tsarless Russia. In the wake of the revolution, Ukrainian nationalists would finally see their opportunity to achieve their dreams of independence and establish their own nation-state, the Ukrainian People's Republic. This would be the last time Ukraine would be independent before the current Ukrainian state would come into existence. They would last only a couple years before being crushed by Vladimir Lenin's Red Army. Ultimately, the communists won, placing Lenin in charge of the newly established Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The now reconquered Ukraine would be forcibly incorporated as one such Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian SSR. Fast forward to Stalin. So, as far as Ukraine goes, I think the most relevant aspect of Stalin is that he was really fond of ethnic cleansing. Specifically, he really liked forcibly relocating entire ethnic groups from their homelands to some ass end of bumfuck nowhere in the Russian Far East, and then filling the now vacant homeland with Russians. He famously did this to the Crimean Tatars, moving them all into Uzbekistan and repopulating the Crimean Peninsula with Russians. Though he did the exact same thing with a ton of other ethnic groups. But it still gets worse than that, specifically in Ukraine. So, there was this class of landowning peasants across the Russian Empire, and especially throughout Ukraine, called the kulaks. They made up the backbone of the food production in Ukraine, being essentially a class of farmers. Stalin viewed them as a political threat. So he began an explicit classicide against them. Land was seized from the kulaks across the Soviet Union to be redistributed to state-owned farms. But while this collectivization was union-wide, it seems Stalin was also using this program to suppress Ukrainian nationalism, as Ukraine suffered the harshest policies and the worst consequences. In Ukraine, the kulaks who had their land collectivized were outright killed if they resisted, and if they didn't, they'd be shipped off to gulags in Siberia, with little hope for survival. This necessitated bringing in new people to farm the land, which meant the new farmers were inexperienced and didn't know what they were doing. Within a year from 1930 to 1931, the Kiev and Kharkiv oblasts of Ukraine went from overproducing grain to some of the least productive oblasts in Ukraine. But this was an issue as the Soviet government raised the quotas in these areas, taking more and more grain out of Ukraine. What would ensue was a famine, and a particularly nasty one. A mass exodus of people fleeing Ukraine would further drain the nation. Cannibalism would even be reported as starvation and desperation set in. Stalin's response to this famine? Laws in Ukraine punishing food theft with death. Laws to prevent exodus by forcing Ukrainians to stay in their homes under penalty of death or deportation to Siberia. Regions with underproductive farms would be blacklisted, opening them up to purges, being forcibly cordoned off, and further grain seizures. Make no mistake, these policies served little purpose other than to exacerbate the famine. And while there was a famine across the whole of the Soviet Union, Ukraine saw the vast majority of deaths. Of the 6 to 8 million dead Union-wide, 4 to 5 million of those were Ukrainians. Ukraine knows this period as the Holodomor, or the Terror Famine. Many scholars explicitly classify this as a genocide, as the consequences seem so engineered to cause ethnic Ukrainians the worst death tolls. Several governments have openly recognized the Holodomor as a genocide. The famine would die down after 1933, less than a decade before Ukraine would be hit by its next catastrophe. This one only partially Russia's fault. See, another thing to happen in 1933 was the ascension of Adolf Hitler to Chancellor of Germany, and he would soon transform that fledgling young republic into the totalitarian autocracy known as the Third Reich. Though Stalin had opposed Hitler's rise to power initially, hoping to instead see the Soviet-aligned KPD rise to power instead, once Hitler was in power, Stalin began working with the Nazis more and more. In 1939, the Nazis and Soviets would sign the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a treaty that was publicly a non-aggression pact, but secretly included an agreement for the two autocracies to work together to conquer and partition Poland. Once the invasion of Poland began, and Western Europe went to war with the Nazis to defend it, Stalin began supplying the Nazis with much-needed oil, something Germany had little natural production of. Perhaps most damning are the less well-known German-Soviet Axis talks in 1940, which would have seen the Soviet Union joining World War II properly as a fourth Axis power. Thankfully, these talks fell apart, as both the Nazis and Soviets wanted influence over Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, and neither was willing to compromise on that. Then, in 1941, Hitler broke the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. The Nazis hit the Soviet Union, and hit them hard, devastating the westernmost part of it, namely Belarus and Ukraine. The Nazis freely and openly devastated everything, so anti-communist were the Nazis that they had come to believe that Slavs were a class of Untermensch due to their inability to keep Russia from falling to the Reds. Subsequently, Soviet POWs would find themselves often sent directly to death camps, rather than the dedicated POW camps they direct in the West. In addition, Eastern Europe had always been an extremely strong bastion of the Ashkenazi Jewish people, and, I mean, Nazis. I don't need to explain how that went. But another big part of the issue was the Soviet response. Because Russia is so indefensible from the West, the long-standing strategy Russia has used to defeat these invasions has been to fall back, destroying civilian infrastructure and agriculture in their own territory to slow down the invaders and deprive them of the ability to scavenge resources. Though this strategy is strategically sound, it's also extremely destructive to the civilians in those westernmost territories getting abandoned, which, remember, are usually Ukraine and Belarus. This would initially be the Soviet strategy. Eventually, in 1942, Stalin would change his strategy and implement Order Number 227, the not one step back policy, where Soviet soldiers were ordered to hold ground no matter what, which turned the front lines of the war into brutal meat grinders, but did succeed in stopping the German advance. Unfortunately, by this point, Ukraine and Belarus had been entirely overrun. The Soviets eventually were able to push back the Nazis, retake Ukraine and Belarus, and transform all of Eastern Europe into puppet governments. Ukraine was devastated by the war. The city of Kharkiv itself swapped hands 4 times, each battle lasting weeks, if not months. The Soviets rebuilt Ukraine in trademark Soviet style. Eventually, Stalin would die, and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, would quickly come to the understanding that Stalin was a madman and proceeded to undergo the process of de-Stalinization across the Union. Most relevant for this discussion was the decision to have the Crimean Peninsula attached to the Ukrainian SSR. This is often referred to as Khrushchev's mistake in the present day by Russian nationalists and certain South African oligarchs, as this now ethnically Russian territory was placed under Ukraine. I would argue, however, that it was also Stalin's mistake to ethnically cleanse the indigenous population and replace them with Russians. There are still people alive today who remember when Crimea was home to the Crimean Tatars. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a bunch of surviving Crimean Tatars moved back to Crimea because they remembered when that was still their home. I don't think Russia deserves a claim to this place just because they did a genocide there. Moving forward a bit, as the Soviets get their nuclear program off the ground, Ukraine is chosen as the recipient of a new state-of-the-art nuclear power plant built on the Belarusian border near the city of Chernobyl. Now, everyone knows about the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, the closest the world has come to nuclear annihilation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What most people don't know is why it happened. It wasn't poor maintenance or negligence on the part of the plant staff, as far as everyone working there knew. Such a disaster should have been impossible, and if the information the Soviet government was telling them was correct, it would have been impossible. See, there was a key flaw in the reactor's design, one which could, under specific circumstances, result in a catastrophic reactor explosion. Soviet scientists discovered this flaw well before any such disaster occurred, and put together a simple fix that would allow the power plants across the Union to continue operating without any such risk. The Soviet government opted to cover this information up. It was, fundamentally, a propaganda state, where any information that could make the state look bad had to be denounced if it could not be covered up. The Soviet nuclear program was an important point of pride for the Soviets, and they were unwilling to let any perception that they weren't perfect at nuclear engineering leak out even to their own nuclear engineers. The rest, as they say, is history. Aside from once again being a massive toll forced on Ukrainians by Russians, this massive near-civilization-ending disaster, caused by the Soviet system's lies and secrecy, sent shockwaves through Soviet leadership. The leader at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, began a series of reforms to try and fix the problems inherent in the Soviet system. This granted more political power to the SSRs, and thus the leaders of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian SSRs jointly declared, with this newfound power, that the USSR no longer existed. 8 more SSRs would join them shortly afterwards, and before long Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet parliament voted to end itself. In essence, this made each Soviet Socialist Republic an independent country. It caused a lot of issues, naturally, one of the big ones being, who gets all the nukes? The Soviet Union's nukes were spread across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Through a series of agreements known as the Budapest Memorandums, involving these 4 countries, plus the US and UK, it was decided that Russia would get all the nukes in return for them, as well as the US and UK, guaranteeing to protect the border of those giving up the nukes. Obviously, Putin would violate these agreements. This was all agreed to by Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, the man who ended the Soviet Union. Yeltsin is a controversial figure, put lightly. His presidency saw Russia's economy collapse, the rapid transition from a command economy to a free market fucked them over pretty hard. Leading officials from the former USSR just inherited huge swaths of Soviet assets and became the ultra-wealthy oligarchs. Other assets were sold off to Western corporations that proceeded to ruthlessly exploit the locals. Corruption became widespread. An explosion of poverty followed. This happened broadly across the former USSR. But in Russia, it birthed a political movement, rejecting Yeltsin and the West. After all, life for the average Russian had gotten worse. Russia had lost its prestige, many of its former territories, and their new leader was letting their ancient enemies carve up the country. That this led to an ultranationalist movement in Russia should be unsurprising. Boris Yeltsin was defeated at the ballot by former KGB agent Vladimir Putin, who repped this ultranationalist movement. Now, Putin didn't solve any of the problems Yeltsin had created. He actually used the corruption in Russia to his advantage and became an oligarch without addressing the lives of the average folk. But he was very good at distracting the population, focusing their ire at someone else, namely the West. As president, he would gradually take over all of Russia's media, attacking independent reporters, literally with garrotes and poison, getting oligarch buddies of his to buy up independent outlets and transform them into propaganda outlets, and of course, establishing the state-owned news empires Russia Today and Sputnik. Soon these propaganda outlets would be repping outrageously fabricated claims, doing apologia for crimes against humanity by Putin's allies, and broadly blaming anything bad that would happen on the West, a fact that grew increasingly more insidious as these outlets spread into the West. Those of you following the current war may have picked up on the fact that I skipped the part where NATO promised not to expand eastward into the former Eastern Bloc countries. The reason for that is that it never happened. It's literally just a lie made up by Russian state-owned propaganda to justify the war in Ukraine. You can check the treaty they claim this promise was made in. It's not there. This is just a lie. Also rather insidious of Putin was to install one of his fascist ex-KGB buddies as the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, a guy now known as Kirill. He basically turned the fucking church into another propaganda outlet with this. And then there's Putin's interference with foreign politics. In Western countries, he's engaged in information warfare, trying to drive division within to weaken the West while also promoting far-right political figures. There's so much I could say about Russian propaganda in the West, but I'll have to save it, because it's been so much worse in former Soviet countries. There, Putin used his influence to install pro-Russian dictators, using what at first was a fairly free election that rapidly became unfree once those dictators were in power. People like Belarus's dictator Alexander Lukashenko, or the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych is much like Putin, a right-wing dictator who made oligarch levels of wealth through explicit corruption, raiding the country's coffers. His former house in Ukraine is actually currently Ukraine's Museum of Corruption. he and Putin stoked ethnic divisions. Eastern and southern Ukraine, the more populous and wealthy parts of the country, are host to a lot of ethnic Russians and native Russian speakers, people who can be effectively manipulated into supporting a pro-Russian foreign policy agenda. This is especially true of the Crimean Peninsula, which, despite the influx of Crimean Tatars, following the fall of the Soviet Union, is still overwhelmingly ethnically Russian. However, the less Russian West and North had been growing a greater desire for closer ties to Europe. Yanukovych had promised to make a trade deal with the EU, only to backpedal and instead establish a trade deal with Russia. This triggered almost immediate protests against his government, as Ukrainians with European sympathies set off to Kyiv en masse in what would be known as the Euromaidan movement. Now, anyone who lives in a democracy know that protests against the government are a common thing, and rarely something the government really needs to address, especially when the protesters represent a minority position, like Euromaidan did at the time. Yanukovych, however, decided to respond to the protests in trademark dictator fashion by ordering police to open fire on the protesters. This clusterfuck of poor decision-making and crimes against humanity would lead Yanukovych to being deposed as president by the Ukrainian parliament, who would establish a provisional government to replace him. That's when mysterious soldiers, referred to as Little Green Men, would appear in Crimea. Claiming to be self-defense forces, they seized control of the peninsula, declared independence, and held a referendum across it that allowed residents to decide whether they wanted Crimea to join Russia or return to a state of near independence under a much older Crimean constitution. The Little Green Men, in case you hadn't figured it out, were soldiers of the Russian Federation, with their identification stripped off. According to those running the referendum, turnout was around 80% and votes to join Russia nearing 100%. Russia would proceed to annex the peninsula. As I think is a fairly predictable outcome of the annexation of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars would immediately come under persecution by the Russian government. This includes up to things like torture and forced disappearance among the Crimean Tatar population. This persecution continues to this day, and has, in fact, ramped up since the start of the invasion. 6 years after the annexation, the website for the President of Russia's Council on Civil Society and Human Rights would release a report stating the actual results were around 30% turnout and about 50% in favor of joining Russia, adding up to a total of about 15% of Crimean residents voting for the annexation. This report would be taken down immediately as it was put up in error, but it was still seen nonetheless. In essence, this referendum, which had no option to restore the status quo, held under a military occupation, a fact that would almost certainly skew the results towards what the occupiers want, had its results fabricated as it was not sufficiently pro-annexation to use. Immediately afterwards, a bunch of similar uprisings would appear in a number of other Ukrainian cities across the east and south. Odessa, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk would all suddenly see separatist movements trying to take them over. The provisional government was quick to quash the ones in Odessa and Kharkiv, but the other two, located in the Donbass region of Ukraine very close to the Russian border, were able to maintain control of their cities long enough for Russia to reinforce their positions with additional troops and supplies. These would become the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and a non-stop war would be fought between them and the Ukrainian government for 8 years. In essence, Russia was taking their success in Crimea and trying to replicate it across Ukraine, tearing off bit by bit to absorb them into Russia. They succeeded in Crimea because, at the onset, Ukraine barely had any military to speak of. As the Donbass War dragged on, Ukraine would slowly build a new military from the ground up. This is where some of the controversial decisions by the Ukrainian government would begin. Most noteworthy was their incorporation of the Azov Battalion into Ukrainian military command. See, with so little military at the onset of the Donbass War, Ukraine turned to militias to shore up their fighting capabilities. The Azov Battalion, based out of the city of Mariupol on the coast of the Azov Sea within the Donetsk Oblast, is one such militia, but one notable for their political extremes, specifically that of neo-Nazism. Russia uses this a lot for propaganda. They say Ukrainians are Nazis because of the Azov Battalion. They'll also point to the fact that when the provisional government was formed, it included members of the far-right party Svoboda. Now, the latter of the two claims is blunted by the fact that after elections were held, Svoboda lost hard, going from 37 seats in the Rada to only 6. Now they only have 1. They thus weren't a big enough party to warrant being brought into the government. But the Azov Battalion is still around, and still full of political extremists. Now, here's the thing about the Ukrainian Nazi talking point. The best lies always have a sliver of truth to them. And Azov is that sliver of truth. Russian propagandists want you to believe that because Ukraine has a group of Nazis they use as cannon fodder, that the country thus must be run by Nazis. This is not the case. The same logic can, and often has, been used to condemn Russia for the exact same thing, as they use far-right extremists on the front lines as well, like the Kadyrovtsi, a branch of the Russian National Guard well known pre-war for their violent internal purge of LGBTQ people within Chechnya, or the Wagner Group, a mercenary company whose founder got a bunch of Nazi tattoos all over his body. And then there's the issue of Alexander Dugin. Now, Dugin's actual connection to the Kremlin is disputed, but it's widely believed he was the architect behind the annexation of Crimea, the Donbass War, and the 2022 invasion, due both to his personal ties to Putin and the fact that he wrote about how all these things should happen before they happened. Dugin, earlier in life, founded the National Bolshevist Party, which proposes to combine the economic policies of Stalin with the social policies of Hitler. It's a neo-Nazi movement, one better known by the abbreviation Nazbol. Their flag is literally the Nazi flag, but with the swastika swapped for a hammer and sickle. Shit's pretty explicit. Ironically, despite the Russian accusations of Ukrainians being Nazis, it wouldn't be long before a Jew would be elected as president of Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky, a native Russian-speaking Jewish Ukrainian from the Ukrainian southeast, was not initially a politician, but a comedian, who played the president of Ukraine on a TV show. He ran for president on a position of anti-corruption and winning the Donbass War. He also had a pro-European position, which, combined with his background in the pro-Russian part of Ukraine, allowed him to reconcile the differences between the East and West. Thus, he won in a landslide. But what of the actual war? So, in late 2021 to early 2022, Russia began massing troops on all of Ukraine's borders. At the south in Crimea, the east in the Donbass separatist territories, the northeast in Russia proper, the north in Belarus, and the west in Transnistria, which is another breakaway province in a former Soviet country used as a thinly veiled Russian puppet. Analysts warned loudly that a Russian invasion of Ukraine was imminent. Putin responded by saying he was not going to invade, and that these troop movements were just military exercises. Then the false flags started. Donbass separatist forces would start getting bombed. Videos of supposedly separatist forces being fired upon would be leaked. Stories of Ukrainian persecution of Russian-speaking minorities would begin spreading from Russian propaganda outlets. These were all fabricated. The videos were staged, and poorly at that. At least one took place supposedly during a civilian evacuation of the Donbass, but left metadata showing it was filmed days in advance. The bombing of separatist forces originated from somewhere in separatist-occupied areas. The persecution stories? Most are completely fake. A few are extreme exaggerations of the effect of a Ukrainian language law. It's all obvious nonsense, fabricated to justify starting a war. Analysts warned the invasion would happen soon. Putin continued to claim there would be none. He lied. On February 24th, Russian troops entered Ukraine from all directions, beginning the first phase of the war, the Blitzkrieg. Clearly, Putin wanted to end the war as fast as possible. Particular effort was put into taking Kyiv, hoping that doing so would cause a Ukrainian capitulation. 3 days after the invasion started, a Russian state-owned news website would publish an opinion piece talking about how Ukraine had already capitulated. This hadn't happened yet. The publication seemed to have been automated, and the article was immediately taken down. But it outlined the insanely unrealistic expectations the Russians had. Immediately, the West hit Russia with massive sanctions, trying to cripple the Russian economy in order to hamper their ability to even fight the war. Though the Russian state has a massive war chest, most of its foreign currency is frozen and inaccessible, and they've been burning through the rest at a rapid rate. When they run out, the Russian war machine is likely to grind to a halt. Worse, though, is that much of Russia's newer military tech is reliant on Western tech, and thus they can't replace much of their new war material if they lose it. Another big problem was, when I say Putin told us there would be no invasion, he told everyone that, including his own soldiers. This turned the first phase of the war into an embarrassing failure. Convoys of troops would enter Ukraine, not realizing where they were or that they were even at war, resulting in them being burned alive in their tanks as they were fired on with Javelin anti-tank missiles, while completely unaware of the situation. The Kyiv offensive became a meat grinder. Russians would throw themselves at the city, get rebuffed, killed en masse, and just keep going because their leaders told them to. Dozens of senior officers in the Russian army, including generals, died here. Many elite units were even sent into Kyiv to try to abduct or assassinate President Zelensky. Western governments urged Zelensky to leave Kyiv so that this wouldn't happen, but he refused, a fact that definitely emboldened the morale of Ukraine's defenders. Another massive issue with the invasion was the Rasputitsa. See, the invasion began at the start of spring. And in spring and autumn in Ukraine and Russia, the ground becomes highly saturated, turning into a mud bog that heavy vehicles like trucks and tanks get stuck in. So Russian military convoys had to stick to the roads. which means Ukrainian soldiers knew exactly where they were. And these Ukrainians were equipped with a massive amount of anti-vehicle weapons like the aforementioned Javelin missiles supplied by the West. And then you had the Russian logistics, or lack thereof. From the start, Russians abandoned tanks and trucks en masse because they ran out of gas, allowing Ukraine to easily recapture them and use them against Russia. Soldiers were starving because they weren't given food and often had to resort to looting or burglary to feed themselves. The whole invasion was a shit show of epic proportion. By the way, the Chernobyl nuclear plant lies on the Belarusian border, so it was right in the path of the Russian invaders at the start of the Kiev offensive. The reactors are actually still burning, as it was not possible to turn them off in the wake of the disaster. Yes, Russia bombed it, because of course they did. Thankfully, it seems the damage was limited, but what the fuck were you thinking there, Russia? Way to give your own soldiers cancer. The Kiev offensive would last 5 weeks, after which Russia cut its losses and ran. Thus would begin the second phase of the war. Gradual Russian advance. The Russians claimed Kiev was just a distraction, to tie up Ukrainian forces in the north while Russian forces expanded their control in the south, due to their supposed real goal being the Donbass. As copy as this claim is, throughout the Kiev offensive, the Russians saw more success in the south, overrunning most of Kherson Oblast, which lay directly north of Crimea. Even the city of Kherson, which lies north of the massive Dnipro River, fell to the Russian advance. To this date, the only oblast capital occupied by Russia since the 2022 invasion began. This is particularly important as Kherson is a road hub, allowing Russian forces in the south to move east and join up with their forces in the Donbass. The city of Mariupol, a crucial link in the road network connecting these two fronts, was completely surrounded and put under siege by the Russians. This siege was brutal. Civilians were trapped in the city, as whenever Ukraine and Russia had agreed to open a humanitarian corridor to evacuate them, the Russians would inevitably bomb that corridor. The death toll was staggering. After 3 months, the Ukrainians, having run out of food, surrendered. Russia claimed victory over the pile of rubble and civilian corpses that had once been a city, and established their land bridge, connecting Russia to Crimea. This was important because the only other way they had to supply Crimea was over the Kerch Bridge, a massive road and rail bridge built connecting Crimea to Russia following its annexation. Because of this bridge's vulnerability to attack, Russia knew they needed another connection, and they got it via the land bridge. Also of note is that Russia captured the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, as it was in this land bridge region. They also bombed this one too. Worse yet, they have begun using it as an ammunition storage while also continuing to bomb it, despite controlling it as a false flag attack. Why are they doing this? Elsewhere in Ukraine, Russian troops would slowly advance. In the northwest, near Kharkiv and Luhansk oblasts, Russia would adopt a strategy of indiscriminate bombing, weakening Ukrainian troops in the area to slowly advance and gain ground. This was a very slow process, but it worked, as Ukraine would repeatedly pull its troops back, trading land for time. This process would eventually see all of Luhansk Oblast occupied by Russia. For a while, it would seem as if Ukraine was losing slowly. That is, until the HIMARS arrived. The US would eventually announce that they would ship the High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, or HIMARS, to Ukraine. These things have pinpoint accuracy, longer range than most Russian artillery systems, and are fast enough to be gone before the enemy can retaliate. The first of these arrived on June 23rd, and almost immediately, this became a turning point in the war, triggering Phase 3, counteroffensives. HIMARS allowed Ukraine to destroy Russian ammo depots and supply lines en masse. Suddenly, the Russian artillery pieces lost their ability to keep bombarding as their ammo was gone. Their one advantage gone, the slow Russian advance shifted to a slow Ukrainian advance. Then, Ukraine began signaling a massive counteroffensive in the south to retake Kherson. Russia began moving all their most elite troops in the small area north of the Dnipro River to defend the city from recapture. Then, Ukraine began bombing bridges. Because the Dnipro is so wide in the south, few bridges crossing it exist. The two most notable are the Antonivsky Bridge in Kherson City and the Novokakhovka Dam Bridge in Novokakhovka. So accurate are HIMARS that it allows Ukraine to destroy the dam's bridge without damaging the dam, repeatedly, launching more missiles as soon as the Russians can repair it. These bridges became unsalvageable. Russia began building pontoon bridges. These too would be bombed to nothing. Now, Russia is reliant on ferries to supply Kherson, which represent a significant drop in capacity. This would continue for months, leaving Russia's best troops trapped north of Kherson, undersupplied, until August 29th, when Ukraine finally began sending in troops. It was pretty slow going at first, only capturing a few villages here and there. Then, after a week, on September 6th, all of a sudden, a massive counteroffensive in the northeast starts, driving Russian troops out of nearly all of Kharkiv Oblast within a week. Kherson had been a feint, tricking Russia into abandoning their forces elsewhere and allowing Ukraine to retake as much land in a week as it took Russia to capture in months. For the next 2 months, that is, up to the time I make this video, these pushes have continuing, Ukraine alternating between managing liberated territory and capturing Russian troops, and then capturing huge swaths of occupied territory in short spans of time. It became so devastating that even figures within Russian state-owned media had to acknowledge Russia was losing. It would be delusional to say otherwise. I mean, most still did say otherwise, but that's to be expected. It's a propaganda state. What would follow is a level of escalation by Putin I could only describe as panicked desperation. Because, you see, Putin is a dictator. And dictators can only maintain control through the appearance of looking strong. If that facade falters, they can rarely keep power. So, Putin needs to win the war, and he knows this. So he begins a partial mobilization within Russia, forcing basically any man of pre-retirement age into the military. The mobilization process utterly failed, for the record. It put on full blast just how dysfunctional and corrupt the Russian system was. Men would be deployed with days' worth of training, would have to buy their own supplies, including fucking body armor in many cases. AKs would be handed out that were almost entirely rusted through. Military storage facilities would be cracked open to reveal most of Russia's military stockpiles had long since been sold off, leaving Russia with a shortage of many key supplies, including first aid kits, winter uniforms, and socks. A fact I imagine will prove incredibly harsh once winter sets in a few months. Conscripts have been getting dropped off in the middle of the war zone without food and abandoned by commanders. So absolutely incompetent has this mobilization been handled that it did way more harm to Russia than it did to Ukraine, and has subsequently been ended, though not before over 1 million men already fled Russia to avoid mobilization, a fact that will undoubtedly hasten the collapse of the Russian economy. At the same time, Putin held Crimea-style annexation referendums in 4 partially occupied oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, the oblasts that make up the land bridge. Like the Crimean annexation, they came with voter intimidation and showed unrealistic support for annexation, a fact especially thrown into question as the Russian invasion all but evaporated any and all pro-Russian sentiment within Ukraine. Before these happened, everyone declared the referendums were illegal, their results would be falsified, and their outcome would be illegitimate. Putin didn't care, he did it anyways and annexed these territories. He did not control any of them in their entirety at the time either. Of course, the real scary thing is, as the mobilization order was announced, so too did Putin make nuclear threats. He'd been doing so throughout the war, but now there was a veneer of believability to them, since he just declared a sizable swath of Ukraine to be Russia, and thus, by Russian law, something he had to defend at all costs. After all, it would be a terrible idea to use nukes. This would all but force direct NATO intervention, which would create a war Russia could never win, and would itself likely escalate to World War III. You'd need to be super desperate or crazy to use nukes in the present day. But now we know for a fact that Putin is both. The US has been keeping a close eye on Russia's missile infrastructure, and as of writing the script, no major movements have been seen that would indicate they're preparing to nuke Ukraine. Ultimately, I don't know if Putin will actually pull out the nukes. As it stands, the war is still ongoing. Ukraine currently has the momentum, and Russia is increasingly proving to lack the capability to turn the war around. People have been discussing whether or not it's possible for Ukraine to retake Crimea or the Donbass. Since a recent bombing on the Kerch Bridge, Ukraine's been declaring they expect to be able to retake the peninsula in coming months. Whether or not Ukraine can pull this off, I feel fairly confident that we will not be seeing a future in which Russia can win this war. The real question is how much damage they can do before that end comes. And that is truly terrifying.